Hey y'all, Dr. April coming at you with a discussion of rhetorical analysis, specifically the three rhetorical concepts: audience, purpose, and context. So let's take a look. So here we have the rhetorical situation model, and the rhetorical situation model looks at a rhetorical situation, specifically the situation involved in creating a text. Here is a text of any document or genre. We often think of the writer and their intentions when they create a text. The writing situation model breaks this down a little bit more, and it looks at co-creation. The idea that the writer and their intentions create the text, and the reader and their intentions also create the text. This theory of co-creation is founded on the idea that after something leaves the writer's hands, the writer's intent isn't as important as the reader's interpretation and use of that material, as long as it's not going against the writer's argument. If I make a claim that the sky is blue, and you say Dr. Sikorsky discusses the sky and clearly says it's purple, that's only partly true. I have discussed the sky, but you have changed the text. So if you take a look at how we get to that text, the writer has influences, beliefs, knowledge, values, and an interpretation of who their likely or ideal readers might be. They also understand their purpose for writing. Readers, or the audience, also has an interpretation of the writer, and that may be wrapped up in an interpretation of the writer and where they're writing, the physical context. The reader has a purpose, perhaps to learn, perhaps to get information to confirm a claim or theory, or perhaps they're looking at counter arguments. And they're looking at this piece, even though they might not agree with it, to see what people who disagree with their opinion may say. The reader comes to the text with influences, beliefs, and values of their own, and they bring those to the reading of the text. That's why when two people read the same text, there can be two different interpretations. Even though the words on the page are the same for both readers, what they bring to the text affects how they interpret it. If you're interested in that, you could look into reader response theory. A reader's influences and a writer's influences are all wrapped up in context. Context is broken down in the rhetorical situation model into three pieces. The first piece is physical context. That is the physical situation that writers, readers, and the text share. The physical context could be the place of publication for the writer, or the place where the reader finds it. If a piece was originally published in the magazine or journal Science, but the reader picks it up in a textbook, their interpretation of how important that piece is may be different. That interpretation, in terms of physical context, is also based on the time in which a piece was written. If we think about the current situation with the COVID-19 pandemic, time is very important. Something written in March may not be as applicable to something written in July because we've learned a lot more about the COVID-19 virus in the past 4 to 5 months. The social context, which you can see as the next level. Physical is the stuff that's closest to us. Social, the next level out, is the societal context. What's going on in society? So it's closer to us. That could be our local community, our religious community, our social community, our friends and family. Social context could also involve our coworkers, our work community, anything that is in the world close to us involves our social context. And then cultural context is a little bit more broad, and it involves anything involving culture. For instance, where we are as a culture, American culture, those sorts of things, Christian culture, LGBT culture, whatever those contexts are that influence us. that influence the purposes we may write and our interpretation of who our readers may be. This isn't just our intended readers, it's also the other people who could read this piece that might disagree with us. And that's why we think about counter-arguments. This entire piece, the writer, their purpose, their text, the reader, the text that they create, and context all make up a rhetorical situation. Audience or readers are the intended readers of the piece, or readers who might read the piece as a counter-argument. When we're going to be talking about audience and readers, I normally think of this as the most likely readers of the piece. You can determine who the most likely readers of the piece are by analyzing the tone, how a piece sounds. That's the word choice, the complexity of words, discipline or age-specific language, sentence structure, and the part of speech, first, second, or third person. I, you, or we. You can also look at audience and analyze audience, determine the most likely readers by analyzing the text. What does it look like? What's the font size? The amount of text versus images, the color, the layout, dialectical spelling. The purpose and the context can also help us determine the most likely readers by looking at what a piece says and what it aims to say. What's its goal? And context. Remember, those are the circles or the ovals. Where the piece was published and when the piece was published. Anybody could read anything, but the most likely readers of a 1972 article about the Equal Rights Amendment in Ms. Magazine are second-wave feminists. In the same turn, the most likely readers or viewers of Fox News are conservative Americans. Looking at who the most likely readers or audience is will help you determine the purpose and also the context for the piece. If we're thinking about audience, we can consider this excerpt from the Ultimate Kid's Guide to Coronavirus. You see an image on the right, some text here, and the citation below. If we analyze this a little bit, we can see that the design and word choice indicate that this piece is geared towards a younger audience. The virus enters cells using a special door on the outside of cells, the new coronavirus, as opposed to novel coronavirus. Those are synonyms, but this is geared towards a younger audience. It has a key to get into the cells, and it opens the door, right? So this is putting things in terms that a younger audience might be able to understand. The image is very simple, so we can also look at that to determine the audience. And if you take a look at the citation, the context or the title of the publication gives us a sense of who the audience might be. It's the Kid's Guide. You can also determine audience by looking at images. On the left, we have an image from the Ultimate Kid's Guide, the piece we just looked at. This image is a cartoon. You can see those little spikes that are on the virus, the keys that the article was talking about. It's green and purple, which are colors that represent illness or sickness to kids, like Mr. Yuck. It shows kids a rendering of an illness. On the right, we have an image, a digital rendering of COVID-19 that was in New Scientist. You can see red and gray, almost school colors, and it shows adults a rendering of an illness. We have the same spikes on the virus, the same keys, but this is a 3D image, and it's a little bit more serious, right? A little bit more upscale, if you will, and it aims to show adults what the virus might look like. If we take a look at a different audience that we can determine from images, you have actual images here from an electron microscope. On the left, we have the first United States case of COVID-19, and on the right, you have an image that was colorized by the National Institute of Health. The ideal audience for these people are probably epidemiologists or virologists, because they need to see how the virus looks and how it works within cells. These are much more specific and detailed images than the digital or cartoon renderings that we have for the lay adult or the kid. When we think about purpose, I want you to consider that everything is written for a reason or a purpose. The purpose is likely stated as a claim early in the piece. You might have heard it called a thesis before. It's developed with examples and evidence throughout the piece. It doesn't only show up in the intro and conclusion, but it's used to set up and explain each example that the writer includes. And it's determined when you're analyzing something by examining the content, what is written, who it's written for, the intended audience, and when and where it was written, the context. To analyze purpose, let's check out the first paragraph or the introduction of that Live Science Kids Guide we looked at earlier. In this example, we can see that the claim is clearly stated in the first paragraph. To help guide you through a confusing situation, here are the answers from science to all the questions you may have. If we'd like to, we could also do an analysis of our word choice here to determine our audience again. If you take a look at a different piece, you can look at the purpose or claim of the article from The Atlantic, Why is the Coronavirus So Confusing? You can see the purpose at the bottom, again, of one of the first paragraphs, that says what follows is an analysis of those forces, and the forces are above, and a guide for making sense of the problem that is now too big for any one person to fully comprehend. Whereas the Kids Guide aims to give us simple answers. The Atlantic article looks at the more complex aspects of COVID-19 and acknowledges the fact that a lot of the situations that we're in and forces that we're under aren't easy to solve. If you want to have a further look at audience, you can look at the sophisticated word choice, the bolded words on the left, and think about how they suggest a more educated audience, or one that will at least know how to look up terms that they don't know. They're not your average lay reader. Definitely not a child, or probably not a child. I think sui generis, and I apologize about my pronunciation, is a French phrase. I looked it up. It means unique, befuddling, confusing, slew of forces, a lot of things, epidemiological, epistemological. All of these words aim at a higher, an audience that's going to have a higher facility with literacy. And what I mean by that is they'll be able to understand the words or look up the words that they don't understand, and understand that that's something that they do as an active reader to understand the piece. The syntax also has complex sentence structure and varied sentence structure, which are two things that you tend to see in more sophisticated pieces. If we think about context next, we're looking, when we think about context, at the cultural, social, and physical factors that might inspire a claim or make a text relevant or applicable. When evaluating context, we should think about the time a piece was published, what social events or what was happening at the time that a piece was published, where it was published, what biases that all publications have biases. So you want to think about what biases are inherent to this publication. What bent or side of the aisle do they tend to lean towards? And also what cultural forces, what norms in the place in which the piece was published, what stories are told and not told, what coded language is used at that time in history, and potentially why. When thinking about context, if we look at the context that's shared with the three pieces we've discussed so far, they all have different audiences, and they all have slightly different purposes. The Live Science article wants to teach kids about COVID-19. The Atlantic piece wants to discuss myriad forces that make COVID-19 confusing, and the Forbes article discussed the first images of the virus that were taken in the United States. But they all three, despite their varied purposes, have the same context. Have similar context. They were all written between March and May 2020. The United States was under a stay-at-home order until the beginning of May. All pieces were published in different venues, and then Live Science focuses on scientific and educational reporting, The Atlantic covers news, and Forbes is business-focused. And there's social concern regarding, in terms of cultural, there's social concern regarding COVID. Regardless of political opinions or age, everyone is concerned about the changes we're making as a result of COVID-19. When we think about connections between audience, purpose, and context, you can look at these images to think a little bit about that. The place of publication in the physical context affects who the piece was written for and who's most likely to read it, the audience. Children for the first image, mainstream adults for the middle, and the scientific community for the one on the end, on the right. The connections between audience, purpose, and context, if you look at current events, social context, that's going to affect the reasoning behind the publication. It also inspires many purposes. If things happen, people write about them to educate others, to figure out why they happened, to offer their opinions. Audience affects how a purpose is communicated and we can analyze that by looking at word choice, angle, perspective, depth. All the pieces we discussed had a similar purpose, to educate readers about COVID-19. However, they all approached this purpose in ways that were tailored to their intended audience. So, why talk about these concepts? Well, in my class, these are some reasons why. But one of the reasons that I want us to think about rhetorical concepts is so we can understand that texts are socially constructed between readers with their own opinions and values based on their context, and writers with their own purposes, interpretations, opinions, and values. Ultimately, the reason that I want you guys to think about the rhetorical situation is so that you understand potentially the relationship between a writer that comes into the center and you as a reader. If you think about that relationship, that writer has purposes for why they're writing, but they also have purposes that are influenced by the physical context they're moving their writing into, the writing center session. You, as a consultant, have purposes to help that writer achieve their goals, communicate more clearly, make sure that they're addressing the assignment. Your goals are based on your beliefs about teaching, about learning, about consultations, about the assignment, and they're also based on your interpretations of writers. All of those things affect how you see the text that the writer brings in. And as you've seen, especially in our face-to-face sessions, or people can be nervous when they approach. That's part of their influence. They're nervous, and we are not quite sure why. In an online session, they might be aggravated, and that's one of their influences, and we're not quite sure why. But it is based on one of the things in their context, their physical, social, or cultural context that might be affecting them in some way. I hope this was informative, and if you're interested in taking a look at some of the sources we talked about, here's the work cited. This presentation is also available under D2L, and I hope that it helps you with the discussion. I'm really excited to see what you guys say about these concepts. Thanks.